Hello there dudes, welcome to part 2 of this 5-part mini-series about learning JavaScript. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at variables, but for those that don't know what variables are, they are basically words that we store values into. You can think of them as containers, so we've got a container where we'll store values into the container, but we represent the container using a word, and the word is the name of the variable. Let's start by using the exclamation mark trick and get some code up and running. There we go. We've got the basic code that we get from VS Code appear on screen. I'll just change the title. So now I'm just going to quickly enter the CSS code that we used in the first tutorial, just so that we've got some styling going on so we can see the paragraphs more clearly. Also, if you haven't yet watched part 1, it's worth watching that because it talks all about what the DOM is. I'm just going to enter some of the paragraphs and the H1 in the HTML in the body of the document, just so it looks the same as where we left off in tutorial 1. So next I'm just going to add the 2 lines of JavaScript that we started with in tutorial 1. So let's save that. There we go. So that's pretty much where we left off. We're now going to be looking at how to use variables. In tutorial 1, we didn't use any variables. We just entered these lines of JavaScript. In one line, we modified the HTML elements, but we didn't assign the object that the various functions return into a variable. In a moment we will be putting the elements into a variable, the returned object by the getElementID and getElements by class name functions. The objects they return, we will be putting those into variables so we can then access the object's elements, the element within HTML, we can access their properties without having to recall those functions each time. But first of all, let's just start by looking at some of the basic variables that exist. So strings and numbers and Booleans, for example. So whenever we want to declare a variable, we use the let keyword followed by the variable name that we want. I'm going to set a variable called myString to the value of Rimmer, which is my puppy's name, one of my puppy's names. So that's a basic declaration of a variable in JavaScript, and then we've changed the value of that variable on the very next line. We can do the same thing for numbers, so if we want to declare a variable and set it to a numeric value, so we don't need to specify the type of the variable. JavaScript is a loosely typed language, so it automatically converts the different values to the type as it sees fit, whereas in say C++, for example, you'd need to declare an integer or declare a float or declare a string object specifically. It won't just automatically know what those types are supposed to be. But in JavaScript we don't need to be so fussy, so we can just create a number in the same way as we did a string. At this point it's worth mentioning that we can also declare variables using the const for constant keyword, and if we do that, so let's create another variable. First thing you'll notice is it won't let me do what I'm trying to do because you can't redeclare the same variable name, so that's obviously an error. If I just change that to number 2, there we go, we're fine. So let's now try to change the value of my number 2. We'll change it to say 16, and we've declared this with the const keyword, and let's just click over to the console window and let's click back over here and save. And we can see we've got an error, assignment to constant variable. We can't do that, that's not allowed. If I comment that line and save, the error goes away. If I try to do the same thing with the let keyword and click save, fine, everything's okay. So we just want to show you the console log function. And this will display whatever we put in there in the console window. I can just put the number 5 and click save, and you'll see the number 5 appearing just there in the console window. But we can also put the name of the variables as well. So if I copy my string and enter that into the console log, we can see the name Ronnie appearing in the console window. So it's always useful to, when you want to know the result of a sum or whether you've got certain things going the way you want them to go, I always use console log. I send things to the console window all the time. Some people talk about it's not a good idea to use the console to do debugging and things like that, but I've always used the console window to do debugging, as well as my other techniques, which is pretty much just commenting blocks of code and narrowing down and honing in on where I think the mistakes might be. And I use console log accompanied with that technique as a way of fault finding. It's something I've always done and it's worked very well for me so far. So I'll continue to use console log, and I think it's a good idea if you get used to using that. There's another type of variable called a Boolean, or is it Boolean? I think it's Boolean. So let's declare one of those. Let's create a Boolean. I'm going to stick to Boolean. I don't like Boolean. And a Boolean or a Boolean is just a variable which can either be true or false. So there are just the two possible states. Let's set that to false. And you'll see that it's in blue. That's because false is a keyword. We can just as easily set that to true. And obviously true is a keyword, just like let is a keyword. That's highlighted in blue. So that's what a Boolean variable is, which is useful for checking conditions when you want to know whether something is true or false. Now this is where it starts to get more interesting. We've got a variable type called an array. An array is basically a list of different things, including the different types of variables that we've looked at so far. So let's declare an array, and we use square brackets for those to put the contents inside the square brackets. And we can put different names in. My old cat, so let's put Jim in there, and then the puppy names again, and let's not forget Ronnie. And we can also put numbers in there, such as 1, 5, 42.67, and we can also put variable names in there, so we can store my number, for example. And we could also put the one that we've set to constant, my number 2. And we can also put my Boolean in there, or my Boolean. Don't forget the semicolon. That is an array. Any old values that are stored within inside square brackets. And you can also store functions inside arrays as well, and other arrays. So arrays can contain all of the variables that we've looked at so far, and they can store functions, and you can then call the function by accessing the array value, which is basically the function itself, because the function name is stored inside the array. And you can also store arrays within the array, so another array, and you can also store objects in the array, and objects are what we're going to look at next. So let's create an object next. And we don't use square brackets, let's undo that. We use curly braces for objects. So let's enter some values for the objects. Now, an object is different to an array, similar in that you can store lists of different things, but there is a property name and a property value. They're associated together. The property name is the key, and the property value is obviously just the value, whereas with arrays, an array contains just the values. So within the myObject variable, we're going to, let's create a phone. And we separate the items with a comma. We can have as many name value pairs as we want, and I'll format this in a minute so it looks clearer. I'm just going to enter a couple more, and then I'll show you how I format it. So the make is going to be a Samsung, and I'll just do one more and then I'll format it. So the next thing is going to be the model type, an S21. And now I'm just going to format this using an extension for VS Code called Prettier, if I just, it's all set up, so if I just select format document, you can see everything's looking lots better actually. Everything's aligned now, so we'll just carry on adding. There's only one more, and it's just going to be the weight of the phone, and that is 171, and I know that because I googled it. And that is everything. So let's click save on there. Won't do anything because we haven't added any more HTML. Now what I want to do now is update lines 2 and 3 with the contents of the array and the contents of my object. So let's start with the array. So what we've just done is the element object, so the HTML element that's being returned by document.getElementById is being stored into the line2 variable, and now that means we can access the properties of that element anytime we want just by using the line2 variable. We don't need to keep having to call the document.getElementById function, and we can then go into its properties using the dot notation as we're about to do. So let's do that next. Dot notation line2 dot, and then we can see lots of different things come up. If we start typing in HTML, we can see that it's come up. So that is the entire content between the opening tag and the closing tag. Let's set that to one of the array values. Don't forget that computers start counting from 0, so Jim is stored at position 0, Rimmer is stored at position 1, and Ronnie is stored at position 2. In square brackets we select the index position that we want, so we want position number 1, and don't forget the semicolon. So if we save this now, line 2 should change to the name Rimmer. So I'm just going to click save now, and it's changed. So we've done exactly the same thing as we did previously, but this time we've stored it into a variable first and then access the inner HTML property. For example, if we wanted to change the color now, just like we did in the first tutorial, we can still type line 2 again, and we can select dot, but this time we won't change the text content, we'll change the style. Let's change the color, and let's just change that to green, and let's click save, and there we've changed Rimmer to green. We can use line 2, like I said, to keep changing it as often as we want without having to recall that function. Next we want to do the same kind of thing but with the object. So let line 3 equals document dot so now that we've done that, we can access line 3's properties just the same as we did for line 2. Nearly forgot the semicolon. Line 3 in HTML, and it's important to point out at this stage that we don't access the values of an object in the same way that we do for arrays. Instead, for objects we access the values by, there's a few different ways actually, but the one that I'm going to show you first is by specifying the property name, because the property name is associated with the value. We type the name of the object that we're accessing the value of, and then within the square brackets we put the property name of the value that we want. I want Samsung, and the property name for Samsung is make, so within quotation marks we put the property name make, and if I save that now, line 3 should change to the name Samsung if I've done everything right, and it does. So that's everything I need to show you for this tutorial. The next one, tutorial 3 in this mini series, is going to be conditional logic, so if-else statements and loops. We can do some really cool things with if-else statements and loops. Then we'll be moving on to, I think it's functions, and then in the final one we'll be moving on to creating our own maths quiz, which is really good. I'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Cheers.